The pressure hull screamed like something dying when the first impact hit us, and I watched Petty Officer Chen's coffee cup, half raised to his lips, explode against the bulkhead as the DSV Triton lurched 40 degrees to port, every bolt and rivet shrieking in protest as something massive scraped along our titanium skin with the sound of God dragging his fingernails across creation. The lights didn't just flicker, they died completely for 3 endless seconds while emergency klaxons wailed in the darkness, and in that brief eternity of blind terror, at 32,000 feet below the surface, I felt the submersible shudder again, felt something vast and impossibly alive rake across our hull with what I knew, even then, even in that first moment, was deliberate, calculated force. When the reds came back on, bathing everything in that hellish crimson glow, Commander Reese was already strapped into the pilot's seat, his hands dancing across the control panel with the kind of automatic precision that 18 years in the Navy's Deep Submergence Unit had carved into his muscle memory, and he said just one word that made my blood freeze colder than the 4-degree water pressing against us from all sides. Something's hunting us. I'm Lieutenant Marcus Webb, DSV pilot 2nd class, and I'd been Navy for 9 years before that morning of March 17th, 1989. When we dropped into the Mariana Trench for what was supposed to be a routine geological survey near the Challenger Deep. Routine. That word tastes like copper and lies in my mouth now, 3 decades later, sitting in my office at the Naval Postgraduate School, where they have parked me to keep me quiet and useful, where I teach classes on deep-sea engineering to kids who'll never know what's really down there. The mission brief had been standard: descend to 35,000 feet, deploy the seismic array near coordinates 11 degree 22 feet and 142 degree 35 feet, collect sediment samples from what satellite imaging suggested was a previously unmapped trench system branching off from the main canyon, and surface before our 72-hour air supply became a problem. We had the best equipment the Department of Defense could requisition without congressional oversight. Triton was a civilian research vessel on paper, but her guts were pure military-grade black budget, her hull rated for depths that would crush a Los Angeles-class submarine like a beer can, her sonar suite capable of painting a picture of the abyssal plain accurate enough to count the tube worms on a hydrothermal vent. Commander Reese had done 47 deep dives, Chen had 300 hours on sonar analysis, and our mission specialist, Dr. Sarah Vickers from Woods Hole, had published 16 papers on deep-sea biology and was supposed to be there just to catalogue any interesting extremophiles we found in the sediment cores. We thought we were prepared for anything the ocean could throw at us. We were children playing with equipment we didn't understand, dropping into a world that had been waiting millions of years for something stupid enough to come within reach. The second impact came from below, lifting us 6 feet straight up before Triton crashed back down, and this time I saw it on the forward external camera feed, just for a second, just a flash of something that my brain couldn't properly process because the scale was all wrong, because nothing that large should have been moving that fast at this depth. Chen had the sonar display up now, painting everything in shades of green and amber, and the reading he'd pulled up showed a contact that the system kept trying to classify and failing. The identification algorithm cycling through whale submarine error, unknown in rapid succession as it measured a return signature 48 feet long, moving at 12 knots, circling us in a descending spiral that spoke of intelligence and intent. Vickers was saying something about how nothing biological could survive the pressure differential. Required to move that quickly at depth, how the musculature alone would require a cardiovascular system that violated every known principle of vertebrate physiology, but her voice had gone thin and reedy with fear because she was seeing what we were all seeing, that whatever was out there in the black wasn't behaving like any animal in any journal or textbook. It was behaving like a soldier conducting reconnaissance. Reese had his hands on the ballast controls, ready to blow the tanks and start our emergency ascent, but he hadn't hit the switch yet because we all understood the mathematics of the situation. At 12 knots, it could pace us the entire 6 hours it would take to reach the surface, and up there in the shallower water, without the crushing pressure to slow it down, it would be even faster. The thing circled us 3 more times over the next 10 minutes, each pass closer than the last, and Chen kept trying to get a clean acoustic imaging profile, but the returns were wrong, distorted by something he couldn't identify. He was hunched over his console like a man at prayer, adjusting frequencies and pulse rates, muttering a stream of technical profanity that would have gotten him written up in any other situation. And finally he got something, a profile render that built itself line by line on his screen, and when it resolved, I felt my throat close up, because I recognized the shape, even though I'd only ever seen it in fossils and museum reconstructions. The head was massive and conical, designed for ramming, and I could make out the distinctive serrated edge of teeth that had to be 6-7 inches long, arranged in rows that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting into the most efficient killing machinery the planet had ever produced. Chen said it in a whisper that carried in the absolute silence that had fallen over our crew. Carcharodon Megalodon, the Megalodon, the apex predator that had ruled the oceans for 20 million years before, supposedly. Going extinct 3.5 million years ago, except here one was very much alive, very much interested in the strange glowing metal cylinder that had invaded its territory. Vickers was shaking her head, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything her education had taught her, and she started running through explanations with the desperate intensity of someone watching their worldview collapse. She said Megalodon needed enormous amounts of food, that the deep trenches couldn't support the kind of prey biomass necessary for an animal that size, that they were warm water sharks adapted for coastal hunting, that every principle of evolutionary biology said they couldn't exist down here. But Reese cut her off, his voice carrying the flat, hard edge of command authority as he reminded her that the Mariana Trench was essentially an alien world, that we'd found tube worms and fish and entire ecosystems thriving around hydrothermal vents, in conditions that laboratory science said should be impossible, that evolution down here had followed different rules for millions of years in complete isolation from the surface world. And besides, he said, pointing at the sonar display where the contact was coming around for another pass, the question wasn't whether it should exist. It was what we were going to do about the fact that it clearly did. The creature, I still can't bring myself to call it a shark, because that word doesn't capture the sheer terrible magnitude of what we encountered, made its next pass just 10 meters off our port side, close enough that the external floodlights caught it for almost 3 full seconds. I had my face pressed against the viewport, my breath fogging the cold acrylic, and I saw it slide past with the unhurried confidence of something that had never known fear, never known anything but absolute dominance of its environment. The skin was dark grey, almost black, covered in scars that suggested a lifespan measured in decades or centuries, and the eye, God, the eye that rolled past, tracking us with what looked like deliberate assessment, was the size of a dinner plate, cold and dark and calculating. It wasn't just looking at us, it was studying us, analyzing us, trying to understand what we were and whether we represented food or threat or something else entirely. The pectoral fins were massive, each one large enough to capsize a small boat, moving with minute adjustments that controlled the creature's trajectory with perfect precision. This wasn't some mindless eating machine driven by simple instinct. This was intelligence alien and ancient and utterly without mercy. Chen got a size estimate from the acoustic imaging that made my hands go numb. 52 feet from nose to tail, probably weighing north of 60 tons. He pulled up comparative data from great white shark attacks, running calculations on bite force and jaw mechanics, and the numbers he got made him actually laugh. That high, thin sound people make when stress breaks something in their brain. At that size, with jaw muscles scaled up proportionally from modern sharks, it could generate bite forces exceeding 40,000 pounds per square inch. Our pressure hull was rated for the ambient water pressure at this depth, but it wasn't designed to resist a concentrated impact from something that could bite through a whale's spine like it was made of breadsticks. Reese asked Chen how many passes he thought we had before it decided to test whether we were edible, and Chen said maybe 2, maybe 5. Maybe it had already decided and was just waiting for the right angle of attack. There was no protocol for this, no emergency procedure in any manual, no training scenario that covered Megalodon encounter in deep trench. We were writing the book in real time, and the margin for error was measured in fractions of an inch of titanium alloy. The creature disappeared from sonar for almost 20 minutes after that close pass. And the waiting was worse than the attacks had been. We sat there in the red emergency lighting, listening to the hull creak and settle, listening to our own breathing over the recycled air system, listening to the absolute silence of the abyssal deep pressing in on us from all sides. Vickers had pulled up every piece of literature she could access on the submersible's computer system, speed reading through papers on prehistoric shark behavior, trying to find something, anything, that might give us an edge. She said megalodons probably hunted like modern great whites, using ambush tactics and a devastating first strike to disable prey before coming back to feed. She said they were probably solitary hunters, territorial, that this one had likely been living in this trench system for its entire life, feeding on whatever came down, dead whales, deep-sea squid, maybe even other large predators that had evolved in isolation. She said the scarring suggested it had fought other megalodons, probably during mating season or territorial disputes, which meant somewhere else in this trench system there were more of them. That last piece of information made Reese finally make his decision. He said we were going up, emergency ascent, full ballast blow, and to hell with decompression protocols because there wasn't any nitrogen in our system to worry about anyway. We were breathing heliox mix at this depth. Chen pointed out that ascending would make us even more interesting to the creature, that movement attracted predators, that staying still and quiet might make us boring enough that it would leave us alone. But Reese had that look in his eyes, that 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans get when they've seen through the bullshit, to the fundamental truth of a situation. And he said staying here wasn't an option because we had maybe 40 hours of air left, and eventually we'd have to ascend anyway, and he'd rather do it while we still had power and control instead of waiting until we were running. On batteries and backup systems. He had his hand on the ballast control, fingers wrapped around the red emergency blow handle when the sonar lit up like a Christmas tree. Chen said, contact, multiple contacts, 5 separate returns ranging from 35 to 56 feet in length, all converging on a position from different vectors, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested communication, or at least sophisticated pack behavior. The tactical display showed them coming in from the northeast-southwest and directly below us, moving at speeds that should have been impossible for anything that size, and Vickers made a sound in her throat like a wounded animal because everything she'd just said about solitary hunters had turned out to be catastrophically wrong. These things hunted in packs, they coordinated, they communicated, and we had just been surrounded by a hunting party that probably outweighed a World War II destroyer. Reese blew the ballast tanks without another word, and I felt the submersible lurch upward as thousands of pounds of seawater were forced out of the tanks by compressed air. Felt the deck angle beneath my feet as we started our ascent at the fastest rate the system could manage. The depth gauge started counting backward, 35,000 feet, 34,000, 30, 3,000. And on the sonar display, all 5 contacts turned upward to follow us. The first one hit us from below 3 minutes into the ascent, and the impact was so violent that it tore Chen's restraint harness and threw him against the overhead, where he hit hard enough to leave a dent in the aluminum conduit before crashing back down. Blood was pouring from his scalp, running into his eyes, but he dragged himself back to the sonar station because that was his job. That was what he'd trained for, and he started calling out positions, even as Vickers tried to get a pressure bandage on his head. Contact below, contact port side, contact moving to intercept our ascent. Path. They were taking turns hitting us, testing our hull integrity, learning about us with each strike. The submersible was never designed for this kind of abuse. The hull was built to resist uniform external pressure, not concentrated impacts from a 60-ton ram covered in teeth. I could hear things breaking in the equipment bay, could smell ozone from electrical systems that were shorting out, could feel the hull plates flexing in ways they definitely weren't supposed to flex. Reese had both hands on the control yoke, trying to maintain our ascent angle while dodging the attacks he could see coming on the tactical display, jinking left and right in what would have been called evasive maneuvers if we'd been in a fighter jet, but down here just felt like a dying animal thrashing in its last moments. At 28,000 feet, One of them latched onto our starboard external equipment pod and didn't let go. I watched it happen on the external camera, saw the massive head come into frame, saw the jaw unhinge with mechanical precision, saw rows of serrated teeth, each as long as my hand, close around the titanium pod that held our backup life support compressors. The force of the bite punched through the pod's housing like it was aluminum foil, and suddenly we were venting high-pressure gas, losing our backup oxygen supply in a stream of bubbles that rose faster than we could ascend. The creature shook its head, the way a dog worries a toy, and I felt the entire submersible shake with it, felt the hull groan as structural members were stressed past their design limits. Reese hit the emergency release for the external pod, blowing the mechanical bolts that held it to the hull, and the creature fell away with its prize, disappearing into the darkness below us, with several $1,000s of equipment and our backup life support system crushed between its jaws. Chen said we'd lost 2 of the 5 contacts on sonar, that they'd broken off and were descending, but 3 were. Still with us, still pacing us as we climbed. He was trying to plot their attack patterns, looking for predictability or rhythm that we could exploit, but what he found was worse than randomness. They were coordinating their strikes to maximize damage. One would hit us from below to drive us off course, then another would be waiting at the angle we dodged to, then the third would come in from our blind spot while we were recovering. They were herding us, manipulating our movements, demonstrating strategic thinking that shouldn't have been possible for anything with a brain the size and structure of a shark's. Vickers said maybe their brains weren't like surface sharks, maybe evolution in the deep trenches had forced neural adaptation, maybe the pressure of survival down here where food was scarce had selected for intelligence over raw aggression. Maybe. But what I kept thinking about, what kept running through my mind, as we climbed through 25,000 feet with 3 massive predators treating us like a pinball, was that these things had been down here for millions of years, had watched the continents drift and the ice ages come and go, had survived everything from asteroid impacts to climate shifts that had wiped out 90% of other species. They were the perfect product of perfect pressure applied over perfect time, and we were soft pink things in a metal can that they were rapidly learning how to open. At 23,000 feet, our primary ballast pump failed, and suddenly we weren't ascending anymore. We were hanging there in the water column, our buoyancy exactly neutral, going nowhere while the contacts circled us in tightening spirals. Reese tried the backup pump and got nothing, tried manual override and got nothing, and the look he gave me across the cramped control space said everything about how thoroughly we were fucked. Chen was running diagnostics, his hands shaking as he pulled up schematics and system status displays, trying to figure out what had failed and whether we could fix it. The problem was in the hydraulic system that drove the pump. One of those impacts had ruptured a line, and we were leaking hydraulic fluid into the bilge at a rate that would deplete the entire system in maybe 90 minutes. We needed that pump to keep ascending. Without it, we couldn't force water out of the ballast tanks, couldn't increase our buoyancy, couldn't do anything but sit here while our air supply slowly depleted and the creatures outside figured out that we were helpless. Vickers said we should shut down everything non-essential, make ourselves as uninteresting as possible, hope they'd get bored and leave. But Reese pointed out that we were leaking hydraulic fluid, that we were probably leaving a scent trail in the water like a wounded fish, that every predator instinct in those creatures would be screaming at them that we were damaged and vulnerable. Shutting down wouldn't make us invisible, it would make us dinner. What we needed was a distraction, something that would draw them off long enough for someone to go EVA and manually repair the hydraulic line. The moment he said EVA, we all knew what that meant. At 23,000 feet, the water pressure was over 10,000 psi. The atmospheric diving suits we carried, the newt suits, heavy aluminum shells with manipulator arms that looked like something out of a science fiction movie, were rated for 2,000 feet, maybe 3,000 in an emergency. Going outside at this depth would require one of the experimental prototype suits that DARPA had installed on Triton 6 months ago, the ones that used ceramic composite shells and had been tested to 7,000 feet in laboratory conditions, but never in the field. Going outside would mean trusting your life to experimental equipment while 3 apex predators circled in the darkness. Going outside would mean being in the water with them, separated by maybe 6 inches of experimental armor. I heard myself volunteer before my brain had fully processed what my mouth was saying. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was the fact that I was the smallest crew member and would fit most easily into the DARPA suit. Maybe it was just that sitting inside, watching the depth gauge and waiting to die, felt worse than doing something, anything, even if that something was monumentally stupid. Reese looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him running calculations behind his eyes, weighing my life against the lives of the whole crew, weighing certain death against probable death, weighing all the bad options and trying to find the least terrible one. Then he nodded and told Chen to create a distraction that would get the contacts away from the hull for at least 10 minutes. Chen said he could do 5, maybe 7 if we got lucky. I said 5 would have to be enough. The DARPA suit was stored in the aft equipment bay, hanging in its rack like an empty exoskeleton waiting for a pilot, and it took Chen and Vickers working together to get me into it while Reese maintained position and watched the sonar display. The suit was called an Atmospheric Diving System Mark 7, but everyone just called it the Iron Man suit because that's what it looked like. A full-body rigid shell with sealed joints and powered articulation. The faceplate was a dome of sapphire crystal 3 inches thick, providing a 180-degree field of vision, and the life support pack on the back carried 4 hours of breathing gas and CO2 scrubbers. The arms ended in manipulator claws that had enough articulation to thread a needle but enough power to bend a steel bar. And the whole thing weighed 600 pounds on the surface, but was neutrally buoyant underwater. Getting into it was like being buried alive in a high-tech coffin. They had to lower me in from above, seal the back plate with 24 individual bolts, pressure test the suit, initialize the computer systems that controlled the powered joints. The whole process took 40 minutes, and every second of it I was thinking about what I'd be doing once they opened the airlock and I stepped out into the water where things with 6-inch teeth were waiting. Chen's distraction plan was simple and completely insane. He was going to use our emergency positioning beacon, the device that was supposed to only activate if we were in a survival situation on the surface, to create a false acoustic signature 200 meters off our starboard side. The beacon operated at a frequency that was roughly similar to the distress calls of whales, and Chen figured that the creatures, being ambush hunters, would investigate anything that sounded like wounded prey. Reese asked what happened when they figured out the beacon wasn't food, and Chen said, by then I'd better have the hydraulic line patched or the whole plan was moot anyway. He armed the beacon, set the timer for 30 seconds, and had Reese use the remaining hydraulic pressure to pump it out through the science equipment deployment tube. We all watched the sonar display as the beacon tumbled away from us, falling toward the bottom, transmitting its electronic scream into the darkness. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then all 3 contacts simultaneously changed course, converging on the beacon's position with the speed and precision of missiles locking onto a target. Reese said go, and Vickers opened the airlock hatch, and I stepped into a space the size of a phone booth that was about to be flooded with seawater at pressure that would turn a human body into paste in a fraction of a second. The suit's systems were already reading 11,000 psi external pressure and rising as Vickers initiated the flooding sequence, and I could hear the water roaring in through the inlet valves, rising past my feet, my waist, my chest, my helmet, until I was completely submerged and the exterior hatch could safely open. The whole process took 90 seconds. 90 seconds of standing in the dark, listening to my own breathing and the creaking of the suit's joints and thinking about all the ways experimental equipment could fail at depth. Then the exterior hatch cycled open, and I stepped out onto Triton's hull, and for the first time in my life, I was standing on the ocean floor at a depth where the pressure would have crushed a nuclear submarine. The world outside was absolute darkness beyond the reach of Triton's external floodlights, which only illuminated maybe 30 feet before the water absorbed everything. The pressure was incredible. I could feel it against the suit, even though intellectually I knew the interior was still at 1 atmosphere. Every movement required the suit's powered joints to overcome the resistance of the water, and the manipulator claws were clumsy and slow, designed for precision work, not speed. I had maybe 5 minutes before the creatures figured out Chen's beacon was a trick. I had to find the ruptured hydraulic line, which according to the schematic Chen had uploaded to my heads-up display was on the underside of the submersible's hull, patch it with a repair clamp I was carrying, and get back inside before my distraction ran out. Simple, easy. Except that I was essentially blind, working by touch in darkness at depth, while somewhere in the black three of the largest predators Earth had ever produced were investigating a false target, and would be very interested in the real target moving around on the bottom. I worked my way along the hull, using the magnetic clamps on the suit's boots to maintain contact with the metal surface, following the schematic overlay on my HUD that showed me where the damaged section should be. The suit's external lights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, illuminating swirling clouds of marine snow, the constant rain of organic debris that fell from the upper ocean layers, food for the creatures that live down here in the eternal night. I found the hydraulic line after 3 minutes of searching, found the section where something had torn through the protective housing and ruptured the high-pressure hose inside. Hydraulic fluid was still weeping from the tear, creating an oily cloud in the water, and I could see where the impact had also deformed the hull plate next to it, leaving a dent the shape of which I tried very hard not to think about. I got the repair clamp positioned, started threading it into place, and that's when I saw the first one coming. It appeared at the edge of my light's reach like something materializing from a nightmare, moving through the darkness with impossible grace for something so massive. The body was all muscle and hydrodynamic perfection, tapered from the massive head back to the crescent tail that drove it forward with lazy sweeps that still propelled it at speeds that made my hands freeze on the clamp. It was one of the smaller ones, maybe 40 feet, but smaller is a relative term when you're standing on the bottom in an experimental pressure suit and the thing approaching you could swallow a car. The eye fixed on me, dark and huge and alien, and I realized that it could probably sense the electrical field generated by the suit's systems, could feel the vibrations from the powered joints, could probably track me through a dozen senses I didn't even have names for. It came closer, and I forced myself to keep working on the clamp because stopping would mean death just as certainly as whatever this creature was about to do. The Megalodon circled me once, twice, staying just at the edge of visibility, and I could see the scars covering its body. Long white lines where other things had tried to fight back and failed, places where the skin had been torn and healed, evidence of a life spent in constant violence. It was trying to figure out what I was, whether I was food or competitor or something else entirely. I got the clamp secured, started tightening the bolts that would seal it against the damaged section of hydraulic line, and the creature came in closer, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if I'd been insane enough to try. The teeth were right there, rows of them visible in the gap between the upper and lower jaws, each one serrated like a steak knife and designed to saw through flesh and bone. I could see the gill slits flexing as it breathed, could see the minute adjustments of the pectoral fins that kept it hovering in place. It bumped me, not hard, just a nudge, the way a dog might investigate something new, and the impact knocked me off balance, sent me tumbling away from the hull with my magnetic boots no longer in contact with the metal. I was falling, drifting down into the darkness, and the creature was following me with what looked like curiosity, its head tilting to track my descent. The suit's thrusters were designed for fine maneuvering, not this kind of situation, and I was burning through their fuel reserve trying to arrest my fall and get back to the submersible. I could see Triton above me now, illuminated by its own lights, looking impossibly small and fragile against the vast darkness of the trench. The creature circled beneath me, and I realized it was herding me, pushing me away from the submersible, testing my responses. It wanted to see how I moved, wanted to understand my capabilities before committing to an attack. This was reconnaissance. This was intelligence. Then Chen must have activated something else, some other noisemaker or distraction, because the creature's attention suddenly snapped away from me, its entire body orienting towards something I couldn't see. It accelerated away in a burst of speed that sent a pressure wave through the water strong enough to tumble me again, and I used the reprieve to fire all thrusters at maximum, burning the last of my fuel reserve to get back to Triton's hull. I made contact, locked my magnetic boots, and half crawled, half dragged myself back to the damaged section. The Hydraulic line clamp was in place, but not fully tightened, and I had maybe 2 minutes of air left in the suit's emergency reserve before I'd have to return to the airlock. I got the final bolt secured, tested the clamp with a sharp tug that would have been impossible without the suit's powered gloves, and saw that it was holding. The leak had stopped. We had ballast control again. The trip back to the airlock was 30 feet that felt like 30 miles, moving along the hull while I watched the darkness for any sign of returning contacts. I could hear Reese's voice over the suit's radio, telling me the creatures were coming back, that whatever distraction Chen had managed was wearing off, that I needed to get inside in the next 90 seconds, or they'd leave me out here because they couldn't risk the whole crew for one person. I made it to the airlock with maybe 20 seconds to spare, literally threw myself inside, and Vickers sealed the exterior hatch and started the deflooding sequence. The water level dropped with agonizing slowness as the pumps evacuated the chamber, and I could feel impacts against the hull as the creatures returned and found their prey preparing to escape. The interior hatch finally opened, and Chen and Vickers dragged me out of the airlock in the suit because there wasn't time to properly unseal it, just dragged me across the deck like a piece of cargo while Reese already had his hands on the ballast controls. He blew everything at once: main tanks, emergency reserves, every last cubic foot of compressed air forcing water out of the ballast system, and Triton shot upward like a cork released from the bottom of a pool. The ascent rate pegged at the maximum safe limit and then exceeded it, the hull groaning as we accelerated through the water column. The creatures followed, keeping pace, taking turns, striking us from below and from the sides, each impact leaving new dents and cracks in our battered hull. At 15,000 feet, we lost the port external camera system. At 12,000, the starboard thruster housing tore free and tumbled away into the depths. At 9,000 feet, one of them managed to close its jaws around the main ballast tank assembly, and I watched on the remaining camera feed as it shook us, as 60 tons of Predator tried to drag us back down to the depths where we belonged. Reese dumped our entire payload of ballast weights, several tons of iron that we'd carried down to help us maintain depth control, and the sudden loss of weight combined with the creature's upward force on the ballast tank actually accelerated our ascent beyond safety margins. The creature let go, probably confused by our sudden acceleration, and fell away below us. At 6,000 feet, they broke off the attack, all of them simultaneously turning and diving back toward the bottom, disappearing from sonar within seconds. Chen said they'd hit some kind of depth threshold, that maybe they couldn't handle the pressure differential from rapid ascent, that evolution had adapted them for the deep trenches and they couldn't follow us into the shallower layers. Or maybe, Vickers said, they'd simply decided we weren't worth the effort anymore, that we'd left their territory and were therefore no longer relevant. We surfaced 3 hours later in choppy seas under a grey sky, and when the Navy destroyer that had been tracking our dive beacon pulled alongside and sent a boarding team across, they found us still locked in the submersible, still staring at sonar displays that showed nothing but empty water, still trying to process what had happened in the darkness below. The debriefing took 6 weeks at an unmarked facility in Virginia, where men in suits who never gave their names went through every second of our dive, every piece of sensor data, every log entry and voice recording. They were particularly interested in the sonar profiles Chen had captured, in the acoustic imaging that showed creatures that shouldn't exist. They impounded Triton, classified the entire mission under protocols that made our security clearances look like library cards, and told us that we'd never discuss what we'd seen with anyone, ever, under penalty of federal prosecution and some other consequences they left deliberately vague. Reese was transferred to a desk job at NAVC headquarters. Chen took early retirement and now teaches high school physics in Oregon. Vickers published her papers on extremophile bacteria from the sediment samples we'd managed to collect, never mentioning anything about what else we'd found. And me, they put me here at the Naval Postgraduate School, teaching classes on deep-sea engineering, writing textbooks on pressure vessel design, living a perfectly ordinary life. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up the classified archives I technically shouldn't have access to anymore and look at those sonar profiles, at the acoustic imaging that captured creatures out of time. I read the reports from other deep-sea missions that have been classified, the ones that mention unusual contacts or equipment damage that doesn't match known phenomena. The Navy has made 7 more dives to that area of the Mariana Trench since 1989, and 3 of them reported similar encounters, though none of them got as close as we did. The last dive was in 2017, and they didn't come back, lost with all hands at depth. Equipment failure, according to the official report, though the telemetry data before they lost contact showed something on sonar, something large, something moving with purpose and intent. We like to think we've explored the oceans, that we understand what lives in the deep places, but we've mapped more of the moon's surface than we have of the ocean floor. We've sent probes to Mars, but barely scratched the surface of the abyssal trenches. And down there, in the crushing darkness beneath miles of water, in trenches so deep that the pressure can fold steel, in spaces that have been cut off from the surface world for millions of years, evolution has been running its own experiments. It's created things that work, things that survive, things that hunt and kill and think with a cold alien intelligence that we're only beginning to understand. The megalodons we encountered weren't evolutionary dead ends that somehow survived. They were evolutionary perfection that never needed to change, that found their niche in the deep trenches and stayed there, hidden and thriving while the world above moved on without them. Sometimes I think about that creature that circled me while I worked on the hull, about the way it studied me with that huge dark eye, about the intelligence I saw there. It was deciding whether I was worth eating. It was learning about pressure suits and submersibles and human behavior, filing away information for the next time it encountered something like us. And there will be a next time. We're diving deeper every year, pushing further into spaces we don't understand, and eventually we're going to go somewhere we shouldn't, disturb something we can't handle, and it's going to come up out of the darkness with those rows of serrated teeth and that ancient, terrible intelligence. And we're going to learn the hard way that apex predator is a title that doesn't expire just because we've decided something is extinct. The ocean keeps its secrets. And some of those secrets have 6-inch teeth and the patience of stone. And they're waiting down there in the trenches, in the darkness beyond the reach of light, waiting for the next time we're stupid enough to come within reach. I know because I've been there, I've seen them. And the memory of that eye, dark and huge and calculating, is something I'll carry until the day I die, along with the certain knowledge that we are not the apex predators we think we are, that there are things in the deep places that remember when our ancestors were hiding in the trees, that will be there long, after we're gone, patient and perfect and